Hey, you made it. Welcome back, or if this is your very first time here, welcome. I'm so glad you found your way to this little corner of the internet where we slow down, turn the world off for a while, and let history tell us its quietest, most beautiful stories. Tonight we're going to talk about someone you have never heard of. She did not lead an army. She did not sign a treaty. She did not make the front page of any newspaper. She never gave a speech or changed a law or sailed across an ocean. She just raised children, fed them, worried about them, watched them grow, and then one ordinary Tuesday morning in the year 1900 she woke up and the house was silent. And she had to figure out who on earth she was now. Here is what gets me. We have studied kings and generals for centuries. We fill entire museums with their swords and their portraits. But this woman, this mother standing in her kitchen at 5 a.m, fire just starting to catch in the stove, listening to a silence so complete it almost rang like a bell, nobody wrote about her. Nobody saved her story. Except she saved it herself. In diaries, in letters, in the ink-stained pages she tucked inside dresser drawers and never showed anyone, and tonight we are going to find her. So before we begin, if you're lying down right now, if your pillow is soft and the room is dark and this feels like exactly where you're supposed to be, would you do me a small favor? Hit that subscribe button, and if this kind of storytelling moves something in you, leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to a channel like this. And I would genuinely love to know, where are you watching this from tonight? Drop it in the comments. Your city, your couch, your late-night kitchen. I want to picture you there. Now dim the lights if you have not already. Maybe turn a fan on low, let that soft white noise settle around you like a blanket. And let us begin. The year is 1900. Somewhere in the middle of America, maybe Ohio, maybe Iowa, maybe a small town in Virginia that you would not find on most maps today, a woman named something like Margaret or Clara or Edith wakes up before the sun. She has done this every single morning for the last 25 years. Her feet find the cold floor. Her hands find the matches. Her body moves through the dark kitchen, the way water moves through a familiar river, without thinking, without hesitating, because the path has been worn into her bones. She opens the firebox of the cast-iron stove and feeds it kindling, then 2 heavy logs. She fills the kettle and sets it on the burner. She reaches up to the shelf for the coffee tin, and then she stops, because she only needs to make enough coffee for 2, not 6, not 7. Not the wild, chaotic, wonderful amount she used to make when every chair at the table had a body in it, and somebody was always spilling something, and the dog was always underfoot, and her youngest was always late. Just 2. Herself, and her husband who is still asleep upstairs. She stands there in the half-dark kitchen holding the coffee tin, and the silence is so loud it is almost its own kind of sound. Now I want you to understand something before we go any further. I want you to feel the full weight of what this moment meant, not just emotionally, but historically. Because in the year 1900, a woman in America did not simply have children, she was her children. Her entire social identity, her legal standing, her place in the world, all of it was woven around the role of wife and mother so tightly that the 2 things were nearly impossible to separate. Think about this. In the year 1900, a married woman in most American states still had no independent legal existence. She could not own property in her own name in many places. She could not vote that would not come for another 20 years. She was not the legal guardian of her own children unless those children had been born outside of marriage. The law did not even recognize her as a full person in her own right. And yet she was the one holding everything together. The United States Census from 1900 tells us that the average American woman at that time gave birth to 3.5 children. Farm women, and nearly half of all Americans still lived on farms in 1900, average closer to 5. Some had 6, 8, 10. These were not just numbers. These were decades. These were the years between roughly 20 and 45, poured entirely into pregnancy and nursing and weaning and worrying and teaching and mending and repeating. A woman's body and her time and her sleep and her attention, all of it belonged to her children from the moment the first one arrived till the moment the last one walked out the door. And then it was over. No ceremony. No graduation. No one handed her a certificate that said, "Well done, you have completed the most demanding job in human history. Here is a quiet afternoon to yourself." She just woke up one morning and the house was empty. The cruelest part, and this is the part that gets under my skin every time I think about it, is that nobody even had a name for what she was feeling. The term we use today, empty nest syndrome, was not clinically identified until the 1970s. The concept was first described in writing by a woman named Dorothy Canfield in 1914. But in 1900 there was no language for it, no doctor to call, no book to read that said, "What you are experiencing is real, and it has a name, and you're not alone." She was just supposed to be fine. She was supposed to smile when the neighbours asked about her children. She was supposed to say, "Oh, they are doing so well. James is working in Pittsburgh now, and little Ruth married a good man over in the next county." She was supposed to seem proud, satisfied, complete, and she was proud. Please hear me say that. She was proud. But pride and grief can live in the same heart at exactly the same time, and nobody in 1900 was giving women much permission to feel both at once. Now here is what the house actually looked like that morning. The bedroom at the end of the hall, the one where 2 boys used to argue every night about who had more blanket, was perfectly made. Had been perfectly made for months now. The quilt lay smooth and flat across the mattress, not a single wrinkle, and somehow that smoothness felt like an accusation. The kitchen table had 4 chairs tucked under it, even though only 2 chairs ever moved anymore. She'd not been able to bring herself to put the other 2 against the wall. Not yet. Maybe not ever. On the windowsill above the sink there was a row of objects, a smooth stone her youngest had brought home from the creek, the summer before he left for his apprenticeship in Cincinnati. A small dried flower from her daughter's wedding bouquet, pressed flat and fragile, now going brown at the edges. A button that had fallen off her eldest son's coat the last time he visited, which had been, she would not think about how many months ago that was. These were her museum. These were her monuments. And every morning while the coffee boiled, she looked at them. Here is what I find extraordinary about these women. And I say women plural because this was not one woman's story. This was millions of women's stories all happening at the same time, all in the same relative silence. The great internal migration of the late 1800s and early 1900s was pulling young people off farms and out of small towns and into cities at an unprecedented rate. Railroads were connecting places that had never been connected before. A boy who grew up in rural Pennsylvania could get on a train and be in Philadelphia in a few hours. A girl who married young could find herself living 3 states away from the mother who had raised her, and the mothers stayed behind. They stayed because the farm needed tending. They stayed because their husbands were there. They stayed because there was nowhere else to go, and no template. Not a single cultural script for what a woman was supposed to do with herself once the children were grown. In the year 1900 there were no support groups, there was no therapy. There was the church, there were neighbours, there was hard work from sun up to sundown, and there were the letters. Oh, the letters. A mother in 1900 maintained her relationship with her absent children almost entirely through handwritten correspondence. A letter from Cincinnati to Eastern Ohio might take a week to arrive. A letter from the newly settled territories out west could take considerably longer. She would write. She would wait. She would watch the road for the mail carrier. She would open the envelope carefully, slowly savouring the moment before she even read a word, because she knew this thin piece of paper had been touched by the hand of her child, and then she would write back. Some of these letters survive. Historians have found them in attics and archives and estate sales, tucked inside old Bibles and hat boxes. They are extraordinary documents, these letters. They are full of the weather and the garden and who had come to visit and what the preacher said on Sunday. They are full of careful, composed affection. They are almost never full of longing, because she would never ever put that in writing where her child might worry. She saved the longing for her diary, and I think that is the thing about this woman, this quiet, ordinary, extraordinary woman of 1900, that moves me most. She contained things. She was magnificent at containing things. She contained her grief and called it gratitude. She contained her loneliness and called it peace and quiet. She contained her fear about growing old, and we will talk about that fear later tonight because it was very real and very specific in ways you might not expect, and she called it faith. She was not repressed. She was not simple. She was not someone you should feel sorry for. She was someone who had been given absolutely no tools to process what she was going through, and she processed it anyway in the small hours of the morning, standing at a kitchen window watching the light come up over the same fields she had watched for 30 years. That kind of quiet endurance, I do not have a word for how much respect I have for it. And here is what I want you to hold in your mind as we continue tonight, because we're just getting started. Her story did not end with the silence. That silence was not the ending. It was in a way that she could not have fully understood yet that morning with the coffee tin in her hand. It was the beginning of something. Something she had never been allowed to be before. We're going to find out what that something was. We're going to walk with her through the days and the letters and the church pews and the late-night entries in the diary nobody was supposed to read. We're going to understand her world from the inside out. The medicine she did not have, the fears she did not name, the small joys she found in the most unexpected places. And we're going to understand by the end of tonight why her story matters, not because she was famous, but because she was real. Because she was every mother who ever stood in a quiet kitchen and felt the full, bitter-sweet weight of a life well lived and a job completely irrevocably done. Stay with me. Let us go find her. There is a phrase that keeps coming back to me as I think about the women we're talking about tonight. It was written by a woman named Lydia, somewhere in rural Indiana, sometime around 1903. Nobody famous. Nobody you would find in a history book. Just a farm wife who kept a small notebook tucked behind the flour tin in her kitchen. And in it she wrote this, just a single line, no explanation, no date. I have been a mother so long I am not sure I know what else I am. That line stopped me cold when I first encountered it. Because in 8 words this woman named Lydia managed to describe something that an entire culture did not have language for, something that millions of women were living through in silence. Tonight in this part of our story I want to go deeper. I want to understand not just what it felt like to watch the children leave, but what it actually meant to be a mother in the year 1900. What the role demanded, what it cost, and why losing it even when the children were healthy and grown, and launched into the world exactly as they were supposed to be, why losing it could feel to so many women like losing themselves entirely. Let us start with something that might surprise you. In the year 1900, the expert advice on motherhood told women in so many words not to love too much. I am not making that up. Dr. Luther Emmett Holt, the most widely read pediatrician of the era, the Dr. Spock of the early 20th century, published a guide called The Care and Feeding of Children that became required reading for a generation of mothers. His instructions were precise and by modern standards almost startling. Do not pick a baby up when it cries. Do not breastfeed. Keep affection measured and restrained. And then there was the psychologist John Broadus Watson, who cautioned mothers directly against what he called indulgent displays of affection. He actually wrote these words, "Mother love is a dangerous instrument." Think about that. Mother love is a dangerous instrument. The culture was telling these women to pour their entire existence into raising children, while simultaneously warning them against feeling too deeply about those children. Do the work. Do not get attached. Be a mother, but do not be too much of a mother. And yet here is what I find remarkable: they loved anyway. Of course they loved anyway. You cannot spend 25 years nursing and worrying and watching and whispering bedtime prayers and not love. The official advice was simply irrelevant to the actual texture of those lives, which means that when the children left, these women were carrying a depth of feeling they had been told their whole adult lives was inappropriate to show. They had learned to contain it, to channel it into practicality, into industry, into keeping busy. And now the busyness was gone. Can I ask you something? If you have a mother, or if you are a mother, I want you to think about this for just a moment. What is she like when no one needs her for anything? Not helpless, not incapable. I do not mean that at all. I mean, who does she become in the spaces between being needed? What does she reach for? What fills the room when the room is not full of other people's requirements? For a woman in 1900, that question had almost never been posed, because there had almost never been spaces between being needed. From the day she married, typically in her late teens or very early 20s, she had been needed without interruption. Needed for her labour, her body, her time, her attention. Needed every waking hour and many sleeping ones. Now for perhaps the first time since childhood, she was not needed in the same way. And nobody, not her husband, not the church, not the medical establishment, not the popular press had thought to prepare her for that. There is a specific historical detail I want to give you here because I think it illuminates just how total and all-consuming the world of 19th and early 20th century motherhood truly was. Household labour in 1900 had no equivalent in modern life. I want you to really picture this. Before electricity, before running water in most rural homes, before any of the machinery we take entirely for granted, laundry alone was a full day's work. You hauled water. You heated it over a fire. You scrubbed each garment by hand against a washboard. You wrung them out. You hung them. You ironed with a cast iron instrument heated directly on the stove, which you had to keep reheating every few minutes because it cooled so fast. One historian of domestic life calculated that an average farm woman in 1900 walked between 10 and 15 miles per day, simply moving through her household tasks. Not exercise, not recreation, just work. Just the endless repeating cycle of feeding and cleaning and preserving and mending that kept a family alive and functional. And she did all of this while pregnant or nursing or both for most of her reproductive years. When the children were at home, this labour had a clear purpose. It was directed at specific people with specific needs. The boy who grew out of his boots, the girl who needed her dress taken in, the husband who needed his dinner on the table before he headed back to the fields. Every task had a face attached to it. When the children left, she still did the work. Old habits do not simply stop. But now she was making 3 loaves of bread for 2 people. She was preserving 40 quarts of tomatoes for a household of 2. She was sewing shirts for boys who were no longer there to wear them, and sometimes she did not even realize she was doing it until the shirt was already half made. The body remembers purpose long after the purpose has changed. Now here is where it gets genuinely interesting to me, and I want you to sit with this idea for a moment because it is one of the things about these women that I find most quietly extraordinary. In the year 1900, a woman's identity had no legal scaffolding outside of her family role. We touched on this in the first part of our story, the legal invisibility of married women, the absence of voting rights, the limited property ownership. But I want to go one layer deeper now because there is something almost philosophical about what that meant for a woman's sense of self. When you cannot vote, you are not a civic actor. When you cannot own property independently, you are not an economic actor. When you are not the legal guardian of your own children in most jurisdictions, you're not even technically a parental actor in the eyes of the law. What you are officially and entirely is someone's wife, someone's mother. That is not an insult. That is simply the legal and cultural architecture of the time. These women did not necessarily experience it as oppressive in the way we might imagine, because it was the only architecture any of them had ever known. It was simply the shape of the world. But here is the consequence that nobody was talking about in 1900, when the role of mother was finished, when the children grew and left and married and built their own lives. There was no alternative structure waiting, no second identity to step into, no cultural template that said this is what a woman becomes after she has raised her family. She was simply a mother whose children were gone, and the world had very little idea what to do with that. There is one more thing I want to tell you before we move forward tonight, and it is the thing that makes me feel the most tenderness toward these women. They were not by and large unhappy people. I want to be clear about that. They were not victims. They were not broken. They were complicated in the most human way. They were proud and sad and busy and lonely and grateful and grieving sometimes all before breakfast. They found joy in small things, a letter from a daughter, a neighbour's visit, a good harvest, a baby's laugh heard through the wall at church on Sunday morning. They were resilient in ways that had been trained into them since birth, but they were also carrying something unacknowledged, something the culture around them consistently refused to name, a form of loss that was not treated as loss at all because the thing lost the daily presence of their children was supposed to be the success, the goal, the point. You raised them to leave, so why does it hurt when they leave? Nobody was asking that question in 1900, and the women who were living the answer, they were mostly asking it alone in the quiet of a kitchen in the early morning, with the fire just starting to catch, and the coffee too strong and the house too still. That question and what these women did with it, that is where our story goes next. Because some of them found something remarkable in that stillness. Some of them found themselves. Picture a map of the United States in the year 1880. Go ahead and hold that image in your mind. Now watch what happens over the next 20 years. Railroads begin threading themselves across the country like veins across a hand from the eastern seaboard deep into the Midwest, down through the South, all the way to California. By 1900, the United States had more miles of railroad track than all of Europe combined. More than 190,000 miles of it cutting through prairies and mountain passes and river valleys and small towns that had until that moment been essentially unreachable from the wider world. For the mothers we're talking about tonight, this map meant one thing above everything else. It meant their children could leave, and they could leave far, not just to the next county the way a son might have moved to apprentice with a blacksmith 2 generations earlier, close enough to ride home for Sunday dinner. Now a boy from Ohio could buy a train ticket and be in Chicago by nightfall. A girl from rural Pennsylvania could reach the textile mills of Massachusetts in a single day. A young man with ambition and a few dollars in his pocket, could head to Pittsburgh or Cincinnati or St. Louis, or if he was feeling bold, all the way to the newly opened territories of the West. Distance, which had always been a natural break on family separation, had been quietly, dramatically removed, and the pull was real. I want you to understand that the children who left were not abandoning their families. They were chasing something that their parents' generation had simply never had access to. In the 1890s, a factory worker in a city like Chicago or Cleveland could earn wages that a farmhand in rural Indiana could not dream of. The Bureau of Labor Statistics from that era documented daily wages for industrial workers averaging between $1.50 and $2, which does not sound like much until you understand that a tenant farmer in the rural South might work an entire season and end up owing money to the landowner rather than earning any. The cities were also offering something harder to quantify. They were offering anonymity, excitement, the possibility of becoming someone different from who you had been born as. For a young man growing up on a farm in 1890, his entire future was essentially visible from the front porch. He knew what the land produced. He knew what his father had earned. He knew which neighbouring farm his mother hoped he would one day buy, which girl from church he was quietly hoping he would notice. His life before it had even fully begun wore the comfortable and slightly suffocating shape of everything that had come before it. The city promised something formless and electric instead, something that had not yet been decided. Is it any wonder they went? What strikes me every time I look at the census data from this period is the sheer scale of the movement. It was not a trickle, it was a tide. Between 1870 and 1900, the urban population of the United States more than tripled. In 1870, roughly 1 in 4 Americans lived in a city or town. By 1900, that number was nearly 2 in 5. By 1920, for the first time in the nation's history, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. Somewhere inside those statistics are the children of our story, hundreds of thousands of them. Young men and women who had grown up helping with the harvest, sleeping 3 to a bed, eating around a crowded table, and who then picked up and went somewhere their mothers had never been and would likely never go. And the mothers stayed behind. This point deserves a moment of stillness because I think we sometimes miss it. We talk a lot historically about the people who moved. We tell the story from the perspective of the ones who left their ambitions, their struggles, their eventual successes or failures in the new industrial economy. We have novels and films and immigrant stories and railroad sagas. We have almost nothing from the perspective of the ones who watch them go. Let me tell you about a woman named Hannah. I'm drawing her from a composite of real letters and diary entries that historians of domestic life have catalogued from this exact period. No single dramatic event, just the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. Hannah was a farm woman in central Illinois, probably in her late 40s, when her eldest son William left for the stockyards of Chicago in the spring of 1896. He was 22. He had saved money from 3 seasons of hired work. He had a cousin already in the city who said there was work available. Hannah packed him 2 shirts, a wedge of cheese, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and a small Bible with her name written on the inside cover. She walked with him to the station in town. She watched the train until it was gone from sight. Then she walked the 4 miles back to the farm alone. Here is what she wrote in her journal that night, and I am paraphrasing from the kind of entries that survive from women of this era, because her actual words did not survive, but her experience absolutely did. She wrote that the walk home felt longer than it ever had before, that the fields looked the same, that the house was where she had left it, that she made supper, that she could not eat, that she did not cry because she was not a woman who cried in front of herself. The pragmatism of that last line. She was not a woman who cried in front of herself, as if even her own private grief needed an audience to be permitted. William would write to her, of course. Almost all of them wrote in the beginning. The letters that survive from this period between young men in cities and their mothers on farms are genuinely remarkable documents. They're full of careful optimism, full of small reassurances. The work is steady. The boarding house is clean enough. The food is not as good as yours, but I am managing, I am saving, I am well. What the letters were almost never full of was the actual texture of city life. The noise, the crowding, the loneliness of being no one in a place that did not know your name. Young men did not write those things to their mothers. They wrote what their mothers needed to hear. And the mothers knew it. They knew it the way you know things about people you have loved for 20 years, not from what they say, but from the shape of what they leave out. A letter with no mention of friends, a letter a week late, a letter that says I am well 3 times in 4 paragraphs. She read between every line. She worried in the space between sentences. For daughters, the story was different and in some ways sharper. When a son left for a city, he remained at least theoretically in contact. He sent letters. He sent money home when he could. He might come back for Christmas or for harvest time or when someone fell ill. When a daughter married and moved to her husband's family home, which was the almost universal expectation in 1900, she did not just leave her mother's house. In the social architecture of the time, she effectively transferred her primary allegiance to an entirely different family. Her mother-in-law's home became her home. Her husband's people became her people. This was not cruelty. It was simply how the world worked. The institution of marriage in the American rural tradition of the 19th century was essentially a transfer of a woman from one household to another. Her mother had known this was coming from the day the girl was born. Knowing it was coming did not make it easier. A farm woman in rural Virginia writing to her own sister in the early 1900s described her daughter's wedding day with extraordinary economy. She wrote something very close to this. The ceremony was beautiful and she looked well. The house is very quiet today. I am glad she is happy, and I'm going to stop writing now before I say something I will regret. I'm going to stop writing before I say something I will regret. That is a woman containing herself at the edge of a feeling so large it frightened her. And she folded that letter up and sent it before the feeling could get out. There is one more piece of this particular puzzle that I find quietly devastating, and I want to leave it with you before we move on. In 1900, the United States government began conducting detailed surveys of rural farm life. One of the most comprehensive of these was a report commissioned by the Department of Agriculture in 1913, which reached out directly to farm women across the country and asked them for essentially the first time what they needed, what they wanted, what made their lives hard. Over 2,000 women responded, and among the many things they said, the isolation, the physical exhaustion, the absence of education and medical care, a significant number of them mentioned something that was not about material needs at all. They mentioned loneliness. Not the loneliness of being without neighbours, though that was real. Not the loneliness of being far from town, but a specific, particular loneliness of being surrounded by the artifacts of a family life that was no longer fully present. The big table, the empty rooms, the garden that used to feed 10 and now fed 2. The report noted almost in passing that many of these women had children living in cities. Almost in passing, as if that were simply a fact, as if it did not explain everything else on the page. So now we know why they left. We know the forces that pulled them, the wages, the railroads, the electricity of the cities, the promise of a life that had not yet been written. We know the scale of the movement, and we know what it looked like from the perspective of a woman standing on a train platform watching a boy who used to be small enough to hold become a figure disappearing into distance. But here is what I keep coming back to the question I cannot quite put down. What did she do next? Not what did she feel? We have touched on that, and we will go much deeper. But what did she actually do on the Tuesday after the train left? What did her hands reach for? What did she make herself busy with? And most surprisingly, what did some of these women discover in the quiet of those first strange, unstructured days that they had been carrying inside them all along without ever having had the space to find it? That is the part of this story that I think will genuinely catch you off guard. Let us go there now. 5 a.m. The house is dark. The fire's gone cold overnight the way fires always do in October, and she's already awake before the alarm, before the clock on the mantel even thinks about chiming, because her body has been waking at this hour for so long that sleep simply releases her on its own schedule the way a hand opens when it has held something too tight for too long. She sits on the edge of the bed for a moment. This is something nobody ever talks about, that pause on the edge of the bed in the first grey seconds of a new day. It is the moment before the day has any content yet, before obligation and habit rush in to fill the silence. Just a woman sitting in the dark, feeling the cold boards under her feet, listening to a house that is not making any noise. Used to be this was the best part, the only quiet she ever got. Used to be within 20 minutes of her feet hitting that floor, someone would need something. A child with a nightmare, a boy who couldn't find his other boot, the baby already fussing before she even got the fire started. There was a time she can remember it with such physical clarity, it almost makes her smile. There was a time when she could not get through the simple act of making coffee without being interrupted 3 times. She would have told you back then that she longed for a quiet morning. Well, here it is. The thing about grief that nobody in 1900 was equipped to explain, and frankly that we still do not talk about enough even now, is that it does not always arrive as sadness. Sometimes it arrives as an absurd surplus of time. A woman who had spent 25 years running a household for 6, 7, 8 people suddenly found herself with a day that kept not filling up the way it was supposed to. Breakfast for 2 took a fraction of the time breakfast for 7 had taken. The laundry, that epic day-consuming, bone-wearing production that had once required a full Monday from before sunup to after sundown, now finished by early afternoon. The mending basket, which had once overflowed with small socks and torn trouser knees, and a seemingly infinite supply of shirt buttons that boys managed to lose through some mechanism that still defied explanation, the mending basket was nearly empty. She had time, and she had no idea what to do with it. This is not a small thing. Psychologists who study life transitions today, they would recognize exactly what was happening to these women, though they would give it a clinical name role exit. The process of disengaging from a role that has been central to your identity, the disorientation that follows, the strange untethered feeling of a self that has been defined entirely by function, suddenly finding that the function has changed. But in 1900 there was no psychologist. There was no name for it. There was just Tuesday. Let me walk you through a Tuesday. 6 a.m. She has the fire going. The coffee's on. She steps outside to milk the cow if they still keep one, and the morning air is cold and clear and smells like frost on the grass. This part has not changed. The cow does not care how many children are in the house. The cow requires what the cow requires, and there is something almost comforting about that, the absolute indifference of farm animals to human emotional weather. She brings the milk in, she strains it, she sets the cream aside, she makes breakfast for 2, eggs probably, salt pork if they have it. Bread from yesterday toasted on the iron plate above the firebox. She puts the food on the table. Her husband comes downstairs, sits, Eats says something about the weather or the fence on the north pasture or what he heard in town last week. She pours his coffee. He puts on his hat and goes outside, and she is alone. It is not yet 7 in the morning. She stands in the kitchen that she has stood in for 30 years, and she looks at the table and the 2 chairs pushed back at slightly different angles and the small precise disorder of 2 people's breakfast, and for a moment, just a moment, she sets her coffee down on the counter and presses both hands flat against the surface and breathes. Then she clears the table and begins her day. What did a typical day actually look like for a farm woman whose children had grown and gone? I have been digging into this question through household account books, diaries, and the kinds of letters that survive from rural women of this era, and what emerges is a portrait of remarkable industry combined with a quiet, unacknowledged sorrow that ran beneath everything like water beneath a field. Mondays were still for laundry even when there was less of it. Old habits structure time even when the reasons for them have changed. The routine of Monday laundry, Tuesday ironing, Wednesday mending, Thursday baking was so deeply ingrained in the domestic culture of the era that most women kept it long after the household it was designed to serve had shrunk. Thursday baking is worth a specific moment of attention. In her prime years of raising children, a farm woman might have baked 8 to 10 loaves of bread per week. Bread was the caloric foundation of family life. Children ate it at every meal, spread with whatever was available. Butter when there was butter, molasses when there was molasses, sometimes just the warmth of it plain from the oven, which was enough. She had baked so much bread in her life that she no longer needed a recipe. Her hands knew the feel of properly kneaded dough, the way a musician knows a familiar chord. Now she baked 2 loaves, sometimes 1.5. She still spent Thursday morning at the kitchen table, with her hands deep in dough because Thursday was baking day, and it had been baking day for as long as she could remember. But the arithmetic of it was different now, and she felt the difference in her bones. A neighbor of mine, and by that I mean a woman documented in a Wisconsin County historical record from around 1906, wrote in her private journal about exactly this. She wrote something that I think about often. She wrote that she kept baking the same amount of bread she always had, even though there was no one to eat it, and she began leaving the extra loaves on the church steps before anyone arrived on Sunday mornings. She never told anyone. She just needed somewhere for the bread to go. I do not know why that particular detail moves me so much, but it does. The bread that had nowhere to go. The hands that did not know how to stop. Now, can I be honest with you about something? I think we sometimes make a mistake when we look at women like this through modern eyes. We look at the routine, the repetition, the narrowness of the world, and we feel sorry for them. We think how constrained, how small a life. And I want to gently push back on that because I think it gets something important wrong. These women were not small. Their world was narrow by our standards, yes. But within that world, they were the absolute centers of gravity. They were the ones who knew where everything was remembered, everything kept everything running. They were the institutional memory of their families. They were in the truest sense of the word irreplaceable. What they lost when the children left was not meaning their lives had been enormously meaningful. What they lost was audience, witness. The daily physical confirmation that what they did mattered to someone specific, someone who would look up at them across a table, or run to them across a yard, or call for them in the night. The work continued. The meaning had to be relocated, and that relocation, quiet, unassisted, unacknowledged, was one of the most significant emotional projects of a woman's later life in this era. She did not have a therapist or a support group or a book about finding yourself after 50. She had Tuesday. She had her hands. She had the slow private work of building a new relationship with a self she had never had the time to meet properly before. One of the things that genuinely surprises people when they learn about domestic life in this period is the garden. Not the kitchen garden specifically, though that was important, but the flower garden. In a time when everything on a farm was supposed to justify its existence through usefulness, flower gardens were a peculiar exception. They produced nothing edible. They served no functional purpose, and yet virtually every farmhouse of the era had one maintained almost exclusively by the woman of the household. Historians who study the material culture of rural American women have written about flower gardens as one of the only domains of genuine aesthetic autonomy that these women possessed. The kitchen was practical. The parlour was for company. The garden, the flower garden especially, was hers. And something interesting happened to many women's gardens after the children left. They got bigger. Account books and diary entries from the late 1890s and early 1900s show women ordering more seed catalogues, experimenting with new varieties, spending more of their afternoons in the garden. The free hours that had appeared so unexpectedly found their way quietly and without fanfare into the soil. One woman from rural Ohio wrote to her daughter, and again I am paraphrasing from the kinds of letters that survive from this era, that she'd put in dahlias for the first time that spring and that she was not entirely sure why, except that she had always wanted to try them and never had the time, and now she supposed she had the time. Now she supposed she had the time. That sentence. The slight wonder in it. The sense of discovering a resource she had not known was there. The clock on the mantel is the detail I keep coming back to when I think about these women and their restructured days. Farmhouses of the era almost always had a clock in the main room, often a fine one, an anniversary clock perhaps, or a pendulum clock inherited from parents. These clocks were wound, carefully kept precisely because time on a farm was not abstract. It was practical. The clock told you when to start the fire, when to expect the men for dinner, when to put the children to bed. After the children left, the clock kept ticking. The house kept measuring out its hours, but the events those hours were supposed to contain the rushing, and the calling, and the kneading, and the feeding. Those events had thinned considerably. Time, which had once been the most scarce and precious thing she owned, had become something more complicated. It was abundant now. An abundance when you have spent 30 years in scarcity does not feel like freedom right away. It feels at first almost accusatory. All this time, the clock seemed to say with every tick, all this time, and what are you going to do with it? She was going to figure that out, and not alone, not in the way you might expect. Because across the rural landscape of 1900, America, something was quietly taking shape, a network of women gathering together, not just for company, but for something that nobody had quite thought to offer them before. Purpose, community, and in some cases something that looked remarkably like power. What these women built for themselves in the spaces their children left behind is a story worth every minute of your attention. Let us go there now. Somewhere in an archive in rural Ohio there is a shoebox. It belongs to no museum. It is not famous. A local historical society has catalogued it under a reference number that would mean nothing to you, filed alongside land deeds and church records and the kind of paperwork that accumulates around ordinary lives. Inside the shoebox are 43 letters written by a woman named Mabel, spanning the years from roughly 1901 to 1914. 43 letters addressed to her son Thomas, who'd gone to work in the rail yards of Cleveland. 43 letters. None of them were ever sent. They were found folded neatly in the order she had written them, tucked beneath the false bottom of a cedar chest in the bedroom she shared with her husband for 37 years. Her family did not discover them until after her death. Her son Thomas, by then an old man himself, read them in a single sitting. His grandchildren later said he did not speak for the rest of that day. I have been thinking about Mabel and those 43 letters for a long time now, because they represent something I believe was far more common than history has recorded the interior life of a woman who knew exactly how to write what she felt and chose every single time to write something safer instead. To understand the letters these women wrote and did not write, you first have to understand what correspondence actually meant in 1900. This was not the era of instant messaging. This was not even the era of the telephone, which existed in cities by 1900, but had reached fewer than 2% of American homes, and almost none of the rural households we're talking about tonight. For a farm woman in Indiana or Virginia or Iowa, a letter was not a convenience. It was the only thread. The postal system of the era was, by the standards of its time, genuinely impressive. Rural free delivery, the program that brought mail directly to farmhouses rather than requiring a trip to the post office in town, had only launched in 1896, and by 1900 it was expanding rapidly. For many rural women this was transformative. Previously, getting a letter from a child in the city might require a separate trip to town coordinated around market days and weather, and the 1,000 other demands on a farmwife's time. Now the carrier came to the road. The cost of a first-class letter stamp in 1900 was 2 cents. 2 cents seems like nothing until you understand that a dozen eggs sold for about 12 cents in that era, which means a letter to Cleveland cost roughly 1/6 of a dozen eggs. Not nothing for a household watching every penny, but not impossible either. And so they wrote. What did a typical letter from mother to child look like in this era? Here is the thing that strikes me most when I read the letters that do survive from this period. They are almost uniformly cheerful, not falsely bright in an obvious way, not performatively happy in a manner that gives itself away, just carefully architecturally optimistic. The garden is coming along nicely. Your father's knee has been giving him trouble, but he does not complain. Mrs. Henderson from the church asked after you. The Perkins boy got married last month, you might remember him. He was 2 years behind you in school. The weather has been dry, but we are managing. Page after page of this. Warm, specific, unhurried. The texture of a life being reported faithfully and accurately, with everything that might cause worry quietly left out. What you almost never find in these letters is the central fact. You never find I miss you so much some mornings I have to sit down in the middle of making breakfast because my legs will not hold the weight of it. You never find I folded your old quilt yesterday and could not put it in the chest without sitting on the floor for a while. You never find the house sounds different now in a way I cannot describe, and I do not know how to make it stop. Those sentences existed. They just live somewhere else. Have you ever written something you needed to say, knowing you were never going to send it? I think most of us have at some point. There is a strange relief in it, putting the thing into words, giving it a shape it does not otherwise have, without the risk of what the words might do once they reach another person. The unsent letter is one of the oldest and most human forms of private expression. Historians have found them across centuries, across cultures, in languages from French to Japanese to Gaelic. But there is something specific and poignant about the unsent letters of this particular group of women in this particular time, because for them the choice not to send was not just emotional protection for themselves, it was protection for their children. A son who had gone to work in a city was navigating a world that was genuinely difficult. Factory work in 1900 was physically dangerous and economically precarious. The average industrial worker in this era had no job security, no sick leave, no safety net beyond whatever savings he had managed to accumulate. If he lost his job, he had nothing. If he was injured and industrial accidents in this period were extraordinarily common, he had almost no recourse. A letter from his mother saying she was struggling, that she was lonely, that she needed him. That letter was not just emotionally demanding. It was in a very practical sense a threat to his ability to function. Homesickness in this era could be genuinely incapacitating. Letters from home that painted too vivid a picture of what was missing could make a young man in a boarding house in Cleveland feel the 1,000 miles between himself and his mother as a physical weight. She knew this. Of course she knew this. She had raised him. She knew exactly how much he loved her, and she knew that loving her might cost him something he could not afford to pay. And so she kept the hard sentences for the shoebox. Mabel's 43 unsent letters, the ones that never reached Thomas in Cleveland, were not all sad. That is the other thing worth understanding. Some of them were funny. Some of them were irritable in the specific way that only a woman writing in absolute privacy can afford to be irritable. In one letter, apparently composed after a particularly frustrating Sunday at church, she spent nearly 2 full pages describing what she really thought of the new minister's sermons in terms that her family later described as colourful. In another, she wrote about a neighbour's cow getting into her vegetable garden with what can only be described as deeply felt personal offence. The unsent letters were the place where she got to be the full version of herself, the funny version, the exasperated version, the version that said plainly, "I am proud of you, and I want you to come home, and those 2 things live in me at exactly the same time, and I do not know what to do with either of them." She never sent those letters, but she needed to write them, and the fact that she kept them, kept all 43 of them in precise order, under the false bottom of her cedar chest that tells me she knew they were important. Even if she never fully articulated why. Now the letters that were actually sent, the cheerful, warm, carefully edited ones, those had their own remarkable life. The ritual of receiving a letter in a rural household of 1900 was not casual. It was an event. When the rural free delivery carrier came down the road and left an envelope in the box, and that envelope had a postmark from Cleveland or Pittsburgh, or Chicago, she knew before she even opened it. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope, and something in her chest did a small, involuntary thing that had no name. She did not open it immediately, or rather, some women opened it standing at the mailbox, unable to wait fingers working at the flap before they had even turned back toward the house, and other women carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, finished whatever they were in the middle of, made a cup of coffee, sat down, and only then allowed themselves the pleasure of opening it slowly. Both approaches are documented. Both are entirely understandable, and I find myself wondering which kind you would be. She read it through once quickly just to check the way you read a message from someone you love in the first 5 seconds to make sure there is nothing wrong. Then she read it again, slowly. Then she folded it back along its original creases and put it in whatever place she kept. Such things, a tin box, a Bible, a bureau drawer, a ribbon-tied bundle that grew heavier with each new letter. Then she sat down to write back. The letters she sent in response were composed with care that I would compare without exaggeration to a craft. These women were not trained writers. Most had educations that ended at the equivalent of what we would now call middle school. But the art of the personal letter was one of the genuine literary forms of the 19th century taught to girls, alongside sewing and scripture practiced throughout their lives. They knew how to open a letter warmly without being cloying. They knew how to report news in a sequence that was satisfying to read the small things. First, the larger things in the middle, always ending on something that would make the reader smile. They knew how to ask about a child's life without sounding like they were interrogating. They knew how to say "I miss you" in 17 different ways without ever quite saying it directly. This was in its own way an art form, unrecognized, unpaid, practiced in stolen hours between other tasks on whatever flat surface was available, with whatever pen was closest to hand. But an art form nonetheless. There is a letter in the collection of a historical society in western Pennsylvania, written by a woman named Agnes to her daughter, Ruth, sometime around 1905, that I consider one of the most quietly devastating documents I have ever encountered from this period. It is 3 pages long. It describes in detail the progress of the fall garden. It reports that a neighbouring family's horse had to be put down, and that everyone felt it was a great shame. It asks about Ruth's new baby with specific and tender questions. How much does she weigh? Now has she started smiling, yet does she sleep well in the night? The last paragraph, which Agnes apparently wrote and then tried to scratch out, but not thoroughly enough because the words are still readable beneath the ink, says something very close to this. I held her baby clothes today, the ones you wore as an infant, and I thought about the afternoon you were born and how your father paced the kitchen for 4 hours and would not eat anything, and I was so glad today, and so glad in a way that hurt, if you understand what I mean. She scratched it out. She sent the letter anyway with that scratched out paragraph still visible at the bottom of the last page. I have wondered about Agnes many times, whether she intended Ruth to be able to read through the scratching, whether it was an accident, whether some part of her wanted the real sentence to reach her daughter after all dressed in the pretense of deletion, safe behind a veil of crossed-out ink, both said and unsaid at the same time. I think it was on purpose. I think Agnes was a woman who had learned over decades exactly how much of herself she was allowed to offer, and who found in that final paragraph a way to offer just a little bit more. The inner lives of these women, the unsent letters, the scratched-out paragraphs, the 43 folded pages under a cedar chest, they did not disappear when those women did. They waited, patient as the women themselves had learned to be, and they have things to tell us if we are willing to listen. But the letters were only one part of how these women navigated the quiet of their restructured lives. Because outside the private world of pen and paper, there was an entire social landscape that was shifting around them in ways they were just beginning to understand. The church was part of it, but the church alone was not enough for everyone. Some of these women were finding each other, forming something new, building in the spaces between their domestic routines a kind of community that had never quite existed in this form before. And what happened inside those gatherings, what was said, what was decided, what was quietly transformed, that is a story that deserves its own chapter. Wednesday afternoon, 2:30. 6 women are sitting in Eleanor Patterson's parlour in a small town in central Ohio, and the year is somewhere around 1902. The parlour is the good room, the one that stays closed most of the week, the one with the better furniture, and the antimacassars on the chair backs, and the faint smell of lavender sachets. Eleanor has opened it today, which means this is an occasion. There is a plate of molasses cookies on the table. There is a pot of tea. There is a copy of a novel that one of the women has brought to read aloud, though they may not get to it today because Margaret has a report prepared on the school board situation, and everyone has opinions and the opinions will take time. What is this gathering called? It depends on the town. It might be a ladies' literary society, a women's study club, a church aid circle, a sewing society that stopped doing very much sewing about 3 years ago and now mainly discusses things. The name almost does not matter. What matters is what happens inside the room. For the first time in the week, for some of these women, the first time since the last meeting, they are somewhere that is not defined by what they owe to someone else. They are not wives in this room. They are not mothers in this room. They are not housekeepers or nurses or cooks or the person responsible for making sure there is always enough firewood. They are just themselves, whoever that turns out to be. and for a woman in 1900 whose children had grown and gone, this room was not a small thing. This room was in many cases a lifeline. The women's club movement in America is one of the most underappreciated social phenomena of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Underappreciated because it happened quietly in parlours and church basements and Grange halls without fanfare or front-page coverage. Underappreciated because it was conducted by women who'd been trained their entire lives not to take up too much space. But its scale was extraordinary. By 1900, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, founded in 1890, had over 150,000 members across the country. By 1910, that number had grown to over 1 million. 1 million American women gathered in formal club structures, meeting regularly, reading books, debating civic issues, organizing community projects, petitioning local governments, and collectively doing things that the culture had told them for their entire lives were not their business to do. And this was just the formally organized federation. Beyond it stretched an even vaster informal network of church aid societies, temperance unions, sewing circles, and reading groups that nobody ever bothered to count, because they did not look from the outside like anything particularly significant. They looked like women having tea. What actually happened inside these groups? Let me be specific, because the specifics are where the real story lives. The women's clubs of this era were not simply social gatherings. They were in many cases the first institutions that treated ordinary women as intellectual beings with something worth contributing to public life. A typical meeting of a literary club in a rural Ohio or Indiana town might include a prepared paper, written and delivered by one of the members on a subject ranging from Shakespeare to American history, to the question of municipal water quality. Then a discussion. Then perhaps a reading. Then often a committee report on whatever civic project the club was currently undertaking, a public library fund, a campaign to improve the local school, a petition about road conditions, a collection for a neighbour in need. The paper was the key thing. The preparation of a paper, researching a subject, organising thoughts, writing them down, and then standing up in front of your peers and delivering them clearly, this was for most of these women an entirely new experience. They had educated themselves at home for decades. They had read whatever they could find. But they had never been asked to take what they knew and make an argument with it in public to an audience that would respond. The first time a woman stood up to deliver a paper at a club meeting was by all accounts that survived terrifying and exhilarating in approximately equal measure. One woman from a Nebraska literary society described it in her diary as the most frightening thing she had done since childbirth, and immediately funnier. I love that she made that comparison. I think she was onto something true. Now, the church had always been there. The church was the older, more established institution, and I do not want to skip past it too quickly, because for enormous numbers of women in this era, particularly in rural communities where women's clubs had not yet taken root, the church was the only organised social structure they had. The Church Aid Society, the Missionary Society, the Ladies' Benevolent Association, these were the original women's organisations of American community life, and they had been functioning since the colonial period. By 1900, they were deeply embedded in the social fabric of virtually every rural community in the country. What did they do? Practically speaking, everything. They organised care for the sick. They prepared meals for families in crisis. They raised funds for the church building, for the minister's salary, for the new organ, for missions in distant places that the women would never visit, but followed with intense interest in church periodicals. They made quilts for raffles. They preserved food for distribution to the poor. They visited the elderly and the homebound. In other words, they did the work of what we would now call a social services network, entirely on a volunteer basis, organised by and for women who had no formal authority, but an enormous amount of practical capability. And here is the thing I find quietly remarkable about the Church Aid Society. As an institution for women whose children had left home, it gave the labour somewhere to go. Remember the bread that had nowhere to go from our previous chapter, the hands that did not know how to stop making things. The Church Aid Society was the answer to that problem for a significant portion of rural American women. It redirected the enormous productive energy of experienced, capable, time-rich women toward a purpose that was recognized by the community as genuinely valuable. She was not just an empty nester. She was Sister Patterson, who organized the harvest supper every year, and whose chicken and dumplings were spoken of in terms that approached the sacred. But let us talk about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, because this organization represents something more complicated and more interesting than it is usually given credit for. Founded in 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union had become by the 1890s the largest women's organization in the United States, and one of the most politically effective organizations of any kind in the country. At its peak membership, it enrolled over 200,000 women. Under the leadership of Frances Willard, who served as its president from 1879 until her death in 1898, the organization became something far larger than its name suggested. Yes, it campaigned against alcohol. That was its founding purpose, and it pursued it with remarkable energy. But under Willard's famous policy of do everything, the Women's Christian Temperance Union also campaigned for prison reform for kindergartens in public schools, for an 8-hour workday for women's suffrage, for the protection of working women, and for the legal age of consent to be raised in states where it was still, and this is genuinely difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective, set as low as 10 years old. These women were not just signing petitions against alcohol. They were systematically identifying every way in which the legal and social structure of their world failed women and children, and they were organizing to change it. And who was doing this work? Who were the rank-and-file members of these local chapters meeting in church basements and grange halls, and someone's good parlour across rural America? Women whose children had grown and left. Women who had time finally and energy finally, and 25 years of accumulated practical competence that had never been pointed at anything outside the household before. I want to give you a specific example because the general is only meaningful when it gets personal. There was a woman named Zerelda Wallace. I always want to pause on that name for a moment because Zerelda is a name that deserves to be said out loud, who was born in 1817 in Kentucky, married at 18, raised 6 children on an Indiana farm, and spent the better part of 3 decades doing exactly what we've been describing tonight. And then, when her children were grown, she picked up her pen. Zerelda Wallace became one of the most effective temperance and suffrage speakers in Indiana in the 1870s and 80s. She was in her 50s and 60s when she did her most significant public work. She had no formal education beyond what she had taught herself. She'd never given a speech in public before her children were grown. When people asked her how she had come to this work so late in life, she reportedly said something very close to, "I simply had not had the time before. I simply had not had the time before." That sentence contains an entire world, the patience of it, the absolute absence of self-pity. Not I was denied this, not I was held back, just I did not have the time, and now I do. The Grange deserves a mention here as well, because for farm families specifically, the patrons of husbandry, which is the full name of what everyone called the Grange, was something genuinely unusual for its era. Founded in 1867, the Grange was one of the first major American organizations to formally admit women as full members on equal terms with men. Not as auxiliaries, not as the ladies' branch, as members. By 1900, there were over 1 million members across the country, with women representing approximately half of that number. Grange meetings included educational programs, debates, and social activities, and the women who attended them found themselves in a space where their opinions were at least nominally as valued as their husbands'. They could hold office, they could chair committees, they could deliver reports and cast votes. For a farm woman in 1900 who had spent her entire married life in a household where her husband had the final word on every decision of consequence, the Grange meeting was not a small thing. It was a practice ground, a place to discover that her voice, when she used it in a structured public setting, could actually move people. Here is what I want you to take from all of this, and I want to say it plainly because I think it is genuinely important. The Women's Club movement, the church aid societies, the temperance unions, the Grange, these were not escape hatches from grief. I do not want to oversimplify and suggest that these women gathered in parlours and forgot that their children were gone. They did not forget. The longing does not work like that. What these institutions offered was something more subtle and more durable than forgetting. They offered a woman the experience of being recognized as a full human being outside the context of her family role, of discovering sometimes for the very first time that she had capacities, intellectual, organizational, rhetorical, creative, that had been present in her all along, waiting patiently inside the business of raising children and running a household for the moment when there might be space for them. Some of these women found that they were gifted speakers. Some discovered they were skilled organizers. Some found that they loved reading in a way that transformed from something solitary and occasional into something central and sustaining once they had others to share it with. Some of them found, with a mixture of quiet shock and enormous satisfaction, that they were genuinely angry about the state of the world, and that other women were angry too, and that this anger, channeled and organized and pointed at specific problems, was not unbecoming at all. It was in fact exactly what was needed. All of this was happening in parlours and church basements and Grange halls across the country, quietly, without much notice from the wider world. And most of the husbands of these women had no idea how much was changing inside their wives during those Wednesday afternoon meetings. Which brings us perhaps inevitably to the other person in the house, because she was not entirely alone in this new quiet. There was a man, her husband, a man who had shared 30 years of a life with her, and who was in his own way just as disoriented by the absence of children as she was, though he would never, not once, have described himself that way. What happened between a husband and wife when the house went quiet? That is where we go next. Let me ask you something that might seem simple but is actually quite complicated. When did you last sit in a room with your partner or someone you have known for a very long time and realize that you did not know what to say? Not because anything was wrong, not because there had been a fight or a hurt or some cold distance that had opened up between you. Just because the usual architecture of your conversation, the children, the logistics, the constant motion of a shared life, had gone quiet, and in that quiet, you found yourself looking at this familiar person and thinking, who are you actually when we are just the two of us? For the women we have been following tonight, that moment arrived not as a single revelation, but as a long, slow Tuesday that lasted several years. And for their husbands, it arrived in a completely different way, which is, I think, the part of this story that most people do not expect. To understand what happened inside these marriages when the children left you, first have to understand what marriage in 1900 actually was. And here I want to be careful, because the temptation when looking at the past is to either romanticize it or condemn it, and both of those responses miss the truth of what these marriages were. They were partnerships, practical, durable, economically interdependent partnerships, between two people who had in most cases married quite young for reasons that had at least as much to do with survival as with affection. A farm in 1900 could not be run by one person. It required two adults operating in complementary spheres, the husband managing the fields, the livestock sales, the financial decisions, the wife managing the house, the kitchen garden, the chickens, the children, the 100 indoor tasks that kept the household functional. The marriage was a working arrangement. The emotion inside it, the genuine affection, the tenderness, the humour and irritability and accumulated intimacy of shared decades, that was real, too often very real. But it was built on a foundation of mutual necessity that had nothing to do with romance. And when the children left and the mutual necessity shifted when there were fewer mouths to feed and fewer fields to work, and the original economic logic of the partnership had evolved into something more modest, the couple was left for the first time with primarily each other, just each other, after 30 years. What did American marriage actually look like from the inside in 1900? The historical record gives us more than people generally realize. Census data from this era tells us that the average age of first marriage was approximately 22 for men and 20 for women. By the time the last child left home, if a woman had started bearing children at 21 or 22 and raised an average of 3 to 5 children to adulthood, she would be somewhere in her mid-40s to early 50s. Her husband would be roughly the same age. So this couple sitting across from each other at the kitchen table in the quiet new morning had been married for somewhere between 25 and 30 years. 25 to 30 years during which, let us be honest, they had mostly been too busy to pay very much attention to each other. This is not a criticism. This is simply the physics of raising a large family on a farm in an era before labour-saving technology. There were not leisure hours for long conversations. There were not romantic evenings for candlelit reflection on the nature of the relationship. There was work, there was sleep, there was Sunday, which was for church and visiting, and the particular exhaustion of a day that was supposed to be restful but somehow never quite was. These couples had been living in extreme proximity for decades, sharing a bed, sharing meals, sharing the specific weight of every crisis and triumph that a family produces while conducting most of their emotional lives in parallel rather than together. And now the parallelism was harder to maintain. Here is the thing about men in this situation that I find genuinely moving, and that I think the historical record reveals in ways that are not often discussed. The husbands of these women were also lost, not in the same way, and not in ways they would have recognized or named as loss. Men of this generation had been raised in a culture that treated emotional interiority as essentially irrelevant to masculine identity. You worked, you provided, you were steady. You did not examine your feelings because your feelings were not the point. But the farm that had once required 7 pairs of hands now required 2. The boy who used to follow him to the fields and learn from him simply by watching that boy was in Cleveland or Pittsburgh or St. Louis, and his absence left a vacancy in the daily rhythm of a man's life that was just as real as the vacancy his leaving had created in his mother's kitchen. He just had no language for it. He had no Wednesday afternoon meeting to go to. He had no literary club, no aid society, no organised space where men of this generation gathered to process the emotional texture of their lives. He had the field and the barn and the fence line that always needed mending, and the quiet at the supper table that felt different from the quiet of a busy household winding down for the night. He ate his supper. He said it was good. He went to bed. And she looked at him across the table and wondered, as she had been wondering in one form or another for 30 years, what was actually happening behind those familiar eyes. The marriages of this era that historical diaries and letters give us glimpses into fall broadly, speaking into two categories when the children leave. The first category, marriages that discovered something they had not known was there. There are letters, not many, but they exist, from women of this period describing a quiet rekindling that happened in the empty nest years. A husband who began for the first time to sit with her in the evening, rather than going immediately to bed. A man who started asking about her club meetings, not because he approved necessarily, but because it was something to talk about. Small gestures that would have seemed unremarkable in a modern marriage, but were in the context of the era genuinely significant. One woman, in a letter to her sister written sometime around 1907, described something that I find very tender. She wrote that her husband had taken to walking with her in the evenings after supper down the lane and back, and that they had started talking during these walks in a way they had not talked since before the children were born. She added, with what I am quite certain was dry humour, "He is not a conversationalist, but he is trying, and I appreciate the effort even when the conversation is mostly about the weather and the state of the neighbour's fence. He is not a conversationalist, but he is trying." I love this woman. I love her so much. The second category of marriages is harder to sit with, but equally important to understand. Some couples discovered in the quiet left by the children's departure that they had very little left in common beyond the children, that the family had been for decades the substance of the marriage, and without it, what remained was two people sharing a house and a history, and not very much else. This is not necessarily a story of cruelty or failure. It is a story of a particular kind of loneliness that is specific to long marriages, the loneliness of being known too completely and perhaps not known at all at the same time. The divorce rates of the era are instructive here. In 1860, the divorce rate in the United States was approximately 3 per 1,000 marriages. By 1900, it had risen to approximately 8 per 1,000, still very low by modern standards, but representing a genuine increase that troubled social commentators of the time enormously. What they did not generally note when wringing their hands about this increase was that a significant portion of the couples seeking separation in this era were in their 40s and 50s. Were people who had stayed together through the child-raising years and found on the other side of that project that there was not enough remaining to keep them. Though far more common than divorce and far less visible was a kind of settled mutual endurance, not miserable exactly, not loveless, just companionable in the way that long familiarity produces companionship without the warmth that might have been there once or might have grown if circumstances had been different. She passed him the bread at supper. He thanked her. They talked about the weather. They went to bed. For years. And then there was the third reality, the one that the statistics on life expectancy make quietly, devastatingly clear. In 1900, the average life expectancy in the United States was approximately 49 years for men and 51 years for women. Now these numbers are skewed downward by infant mortality. The children who did not survive childhood pulled the average considerably lower than the actual lifespan of someone who had already made it to adulthood. An adult who had reached the age of 50 in 1900 could reasonably expect to live into their late 60s or even 70s. But the gap between male and female mortality was real. Men died younger. Men died of farm accidents, of industrial injuries, of the accumulated physical toll of outdoor labour in an era without modern medicine. Men died of the things that went undiagnosed because seeking medical care required a trip to town and an admission of vulnerability that the culture of the era made extremely difficult. The statistical reality of a marriage in 1900 was this. In the later years of a couple's life, one of them was very likely to be alone, and it was almost always her. Widowhood in this era was not simply an emotional state. It was an economic condition, and a legal one and a social one all simultaneously. A widow in 1900 had in most states the right to 1/3 of her late husband's estate, a legal provision called dower rights that dated back to English common law. The other 2/3 typically passed to children or other heirs. If the couple had been farming, the farm might need to be sold or transferred. If she had no sons to continue working the land, she might find herself at the mercy of a son-in-law's generosity, or a daughter's goodwill, or in harder cases the county poorhouse. There is a reason the women in this era worried about old age with such specific practical anxiety. The stakes were not abstract. They were the difference between a room of your own in your son's house and a cot in the almshouse at the edge of town. And yet, and this is the part that continues to move me, many of the widows of this era found something they had not expected to find. Themselves. Not in a triumphant, liberating way, not in the way a modern self-help narrative might describe. More quietly than that. More ambiguously. A woman who had organized her entire life around serving others, finding in the enforced solitude of widowhood that she was actually quite capable of making decisions, that she had opinions about things, that she knew without anyone to consult exactly how she wanted to arrange the furniture. There is a letter in a historical collection from a woman named Harriet, written to her daughter approximately 2 years after Harriet's husband died. The letter is warm and practical and full of the kind of domestic news that fills these documents. And near the end, almost as an aside, Harriet writes something I have never forgotten. She writes, "I find I'm less lonely than I expected. I thought the quiet would be unbearable, and it is not. I think I may have been lonelier when your father was alive and we did not know how to find each other. Now it is just me and the quiet, and we're getting on reasonably well. I think I may have been lonelier when your father was alive and we did not know how to find each other." Harriet was not being unkind. She was being honest in the way that women of this generation were often most honest in letters, in the small hours, in the spaces where nobody was watching. Her marriage had been real. Her love had been real. And the quiet that came after was in its own strange way also real and livable and hers. But the marriage was only one relationship that these women were navigating in their later years. Because somewhere out there in a city or on a neighbouring farm, something was happening that was about to change everything. A grandchild was coming. And if you think the empty nest was complicated, if you think watching your children leave was a thing that required courage and adaptation, and the quiet rebuilding of a self, wait until you hear what happened when the first grandchild arrived. Because that story is something else entirely. Let us keep going. The letter arrived on a Thursday. She'd been watching for it for 2 weeks already, checking the mailbox each morning with a particular quality of attention that was different from ordinary mail watching. More careful, more physically aware, the way your whole body orients towards something it has been waiting for, without being told to. The envelope was from her daughter, Ruth, in Columbus. The handwriting on the outside was not Ruth's, it was her son-in-law's, which meant Ruth had not been able to write it herself, which meant she opened it right there at the mailbox. Her hands were not entirely steady. The baby had arrived on the 14th of October. A girl. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Mother and child were well. They had named her Clara. She read those 4 sentences 3 times standing in the October morning, with the frost still on the grass, and the letter shaking just slightly in her hands. And then she did something that nobody was watching, which is the only reason I feel comfortable telling you about it. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh, a real one surprised out of her by a wave of something so large and warm and sudden that it had to go somewhere, and it went up and out of her as laughter into the cold morning air in the middle of a field in Ohio over a piece of paper that told her she was a grandmother. Clara. There was a Clara in the world now, The arrival of a grandchild in the life of a woman who had spent the previous several years navigating the quiet of an empty house was, by every account that survives from this era, one of the most significant emotional events of her later life. Not the most significant that was always the children themselves the original act of becoming a mother. But this was different. This was something she had not anticipated feeling quite so much. And to understand why, you have to understand what grandmotherhood actually meant in 1900, because it was not what it means today. We tend to think of grandmothers now in a particular way, the warm, slightly peripheral figure who spoils. The grandchildren sends birthday cards, attends recitals, and provides a kind of loving backdrop to the main action of family life. Involved, but not central. Present, but not essential. In 1900, in many families, the grandmother was essential. In rural communities where extended families still lived in geographic proximity, and many did, especially in the South and Midwest, the grandmother was frequently the most experienced person in the room during a birth. Formal obstetric care was limited and expensive. A doctor in a rural area might be several hours away, and by the time he arrived, the baby had often already made its own entrance with no regard whatsoever for medical scheduling. What you had instead was experience. An experience in childbirth meant women who had been through it themselves, mothers, grandmothers, neighbours who had attended a dozen births between them. The grandmother who lived close enough was not just a visitor after the fact. She was often present at the birth itself or arrived within days of it. She was the one who knew what a new mother needed, not from a book but from her own body's memory. She knew how to help a baby latch when nursing was difficult. She knew which herb teas settled a colicky infant. She knew from hard experience the difference between normal exhaustion and something that warranted concern. Her knowledge was practical, accumulated, and irreplaceable in an era when most of what was known about infant care was passed down through women rather than written in textbooks. But here is the complication, and it is one that sits at the heart of the grandmother's experience in 1900 in a way that I find genuinely poignant. By the time these women became grandmothers, the culture around childbirth and infant care was changing rapidly, and not always in ways that made room for what they knew. Remember Dr. Holt, whose advice about not picking up crying babies we mentioned earlier in our story? His enormously influential guide to infant care had a second, quieter effect beyond its instructions to mothers. It implicitly repositioned the grandmother. For centuries, the transmission of knowledge about babies had flowed between women from grandmother to mother, from neighbour to neighbour, from midwife to young wife. It was oral, embodied, practical knowledge held in female hands and passed through female relationships. The new scientific approach to child-rearing in the progressive era wanted to replace that transmission. It wanted young mothers to get their information from doctors and published guides, not from their own mothers and grandmothers. The grandmother's knowledge was being reframed subtly but persistently as old-fashioned, possibly dangerous, certainly less reliable than the pronouncements of a trained professional. Can you imagine how that landed on a woman who had raised 5 children and helped attend the births of half her neighbourhood? She did not say anything generally. She held her tongue with the particular discipline that a lifetime of holding her tongue had given her. She smiled and nodded when her daughter mentioned what Dr. Holt said about feeding schedules. She waited until her daughter left the room to roll her eyes, or maybe she did not even do that. Maybe she had long since made peace with the particular frustration of being an expert in a room that has decided your expertise is obsolete. For the many grandmothers who did not live near their children, and as we have established, the railroad had scattered families across enormous distances, the arrival of a grandchild was experienced in a completely different way. It was experienced in an envelope. The letter arrives 2 weeks after the birth. She reads it. She cries or laughs or both. She writes back immediately, not the next day, immediately, and her response goes into the mail that afternoon. Her letter will take another week to arrive. By the time her first reply reaches her daughter, the baby Clara will be 3 weeks old. By the time she receives a reply to her reply, Clara will be 5 weeks old. She will not see Clara for months. Perhaps not until the following spring, when travel is easier and the roads are passable, and her son-in-law can spare the time from his work to have house guests for a week. Perhaps longer. Think about that for a moment. In the year 1900, it was entirely possible for a grandmother to be 3 months old in a grandchild's life before she had held that child. 3 months of a baby's life received only in words, in descriptions that tried with whatever literary skill the writer possessed to convey what it felt like to hold a 7-pound creature who smelled like milk and looked apparently a great deal like the family on her mother's side. She read those descriptions with a hunger that was physical. She pressed the letters flat on the kitchen table and read every sentence twice. She asked for details that most letter writers would not think to include. Does she hold her head up yet? What colour are her eyes now? Has she started to recognise faces? She constructed the baby in her mind out of words, building a person she had not yet met from the raw material of other people's observations. And she loved this constructed baby with a completeness that surprised her, loved her, before she'd ever touched her the way you can love a story before it is finished. When the visit finally came, when she saw Clara for the first time, what happened in that moment was something that diaries from this era describe in remarkably similar terms, regardless of where the woman was from or how many grandchildren she eventually had. She held the baby and went quiet. Not sad quiet. Not the hollow quiet of the empty house that we've been talking about all evening. A different quality of quiet entirely, the kind that comes when something so much larger than ordinary life walks into the room, that ordinary language simply steps aside. A grandmother in a letter to her own sister, writing from somewhere in rural Pennsylvania around 1904, described it this way. I held her, and I thought of when I held her mother for the first time, and the 2 moments lived inside me at the same time, and I cannot explain it except to say that I understood, holding her, that time is not a line at all. It is more like a room, and everything that ever mattered is still in it all at once. Time is not a line at all. It is more like a room. I want to say as gently as possible that this woman with no formal education writing in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania in 1904 stumbled onto something that philosophers and poets have been trying to articulate for centuries. The experience of loving a grandchild in a way that collapses the distance between past and present, that folds your own youth and your own children's infancy back into the present moment through the body of this new small person. She got it in 1 sentence. Just holding a baby. Now the role of grandmother in 1900 was not without its tensions. I want to be honest about that because the picture I have been painting is warm, and I do not want it to be false. The grandmother who came to stay, and many did come to stay for weeks or months at a stretch, particularly when a new baby arrived or when illness visited, the family occupied a position of considerable social delicacy. She was experienced, and she was in someone else's house. She knew things, and she was not in charge. She had opinions, and she had been trained her entire life to express opinions with a certain amount of careful packaging. The relationship between a grandmother and a daughter-in-law in particular was one of the most navigated relationships in domestic life of this era. She was living under the roof of a woman whose home this was, whose household rhythms were established, whose husband was this woman's son, and therefore both deeply known and suddenly mysterious in the context of being someone's husband. She watched her son with his wife and saw things she recognized and things she did not. She watched the baby being handled and bit her tongue about the swaddling, and bit her tongue about the feeding schedule, and bit her tongue in general with the extraordinary discipline of a woman who understood that her welcome depended in part on the careful management of her own knowledge. It is not easy to know things and choose silence. It is one of the less celebrated skills of grandmotherhood, and in 1900 it was practiced daily. And yet, and this is the part that matters most, I think the grandmother's visit changed something in the house. It changed something in the daughter, or the daughter-in-law, who had been perhaps feeling the weight of new parenthood in the specific exhausted, slightly frightened way that all new parents feel it. Because the grandmother brought with her something that no book and no doctor could provide: steadiness. The particular steadiness of a woman who has been through this before and come out the other side, who looks at a colicky baby and does not panic, who looks at a new mother's exhausted face and recognizes it from the inside, not just from the outside, and knows exactly what to say, which is sometimes something practical, and sometimes is nothing at all, just the presence of a person who knows that this is hard and that hard things end. One of the greatest gifts one generation of women ever gave another was simply this being there without alarm. She had been through it. She knew it did not last. She knew the baby would sleep eventually. She knew the mother would feel like herself again eventually. She knew. And knowing and being present with that knowing and transmitting it through proximity rather than instruction that was the grandmother's art. Unrecognized, uncelebrated, practiced in kitchens and back bedrooms in farmhouses across the country by women who had been told by the new scientific culture of the era that their knowledge was outdated. Their knowledge was not outdated, it was irreplaceable, and the daughters who received it, even when they nodded politely at Dr. Holt and did things their own way, and rolled their own eyes when grandmother left the room, those daughters carried what they had absorbed in their bones long after the books had been forgotten. The grandchild was a gift. I want to say that plainly without qualification. After years of a quiet house and unsent letters and Wednesday meetings, and a husband who talked mostly about the fence line, after all of that necessary, difficult private work of reconstructing a self in the absence of the role that had defined her, Clara arrived, and with Clara came something the empty nest had taken away, someone who needed her specifically. Not her labour in general, not her capability in the abstract, but her voice, her hands, her smell, her particular way of holding a small body against a chest that had held many small bodies before, and remembered exactly what to do. The grandchild needed grandmother, not in the exhausting, total body-consuming way that infants need mothers, but in a real way, a particular way, a way that felt to a woman who had spent the previous years quietly rebuilding her sense of purpose, like arriving somewhere she'd been heading without knowing it. But there was a shadow alongside this joy, and it was a shadow that these women carried into their later years with more anxiety than they generally showed. What happened when the body began to fail? What happened when age brought not just grandchildren and Wednesday meetings and letters from Ohio, but also something harder, something the era had almost no tools to address? That question, the one about growing old in a world without modern medicine, is where our story goes next, and the answer is more surprising than you might expect. At some point in her late 40s, something began to change. It happened gradually, the way most significant things happen, not as a single event, but as a slow accumulation of small differences that one morning she could no longer pretend were not there. She slept differently. Her body ran warmer than it used to, sometimes so warm in the night that she lay on top of the covers in October. There were days when her joints ached with a persistence that was new, Not the honest tiredness of hard work, but something deeper, something that did not go away with sleep. Her mood shifted in ways she could not predict or control. Not that she had ever been a woman who lost control of her emotions in any visible way, because she had not the training of a lifetime had made sure of that. But something internal was different, like a compass needle that kept swinging before settling. She did not talk about any of this. Not to her husband, who would not have known what to say. Not to her daughters, who were in Columbus or Cincinnati and had their own concerns. Not to the doctor in town, because visiting the doctor required a trip to town and a fee, and a particular kind of conversation that the culture of the era made almost impossible to begin. She just managed, the way she managed everything. Quietly, competently, without acknowledgement and without complaint. Here is the thing that I find genuinely extraordinary about the health experience of women in 1900, and I want you to understand this fully before we go any further. Menopause, the physical process she was experiencing, which affects every woman who lives long enough, and is as natural and inevitable as any other biological transition, did not have a widely used clinical name in common American medical practice until well into the 20th century. The French term had existed since the 1820s, but in the practical landscape of rural American medicine in 1900, it was not a diagnosis. It was not a recognized condition that a patient might present to a doctor and receive treatment for. It was simply what happened to women of a certain age. It was expected to be endured. It was essentially invisible as a medical subject. The standard medical literature of the late 19th century, when it addressed women's health at all, tended to describe middle age in women with a combination of clinical vagueness and barely concealed alarm. Some texts described the period of transition as inherently destabilizing, not just physically, but emotionally and morally. There was a persistent belief among certain medical writers that women of menopausal age were at particular risk of what they called nervous conditions, a catch-all category that covered everything from genuine depression to the simple act of having a difficult feeling and no socially acceptable way to express it. The prescription was almost invariably the same rest-calm avoidance of excitement, and what one popular health guide of the era described as a cheerful and resigned acceptance of the changes that Providence has seen fit to bestow. Cheerful and resigned acceptance. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because it asks something rather remarkable of a woman. It asks her to be both cheerful, which implies active positive emotion, and resigned, which implies the surrender of any expectation that things might be otherwise. To simultaneously smile and give up. These women were asked to perform an emotional impossibility, and most of them performed it without complaint because they had been performing emotional impossibilities their entire lives. What did she do when something was genuinely wrong? The country doctor was in most rural areas of 1900, the primary and often the only medical resource available to a farm family. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, varied enormously in their training and competence. Some were genuinely well-educated physicians who had graduated from reputable medical schools and kept current with developments in the field. Others had received what amounted to apprenticeship training learning medicine by working alongside an established practitioner rather than through formal study. The American Medical Association had only begun serious efforts to standardize medical education and licensing in the 1890s. By 1900, those efforts were well underway but far from complete. A rural farm woman seeking medical care had no reliable way to know how qualified her local physician actually was, and in any case she often had no alternative. A visit from the doctor typically cost between $1 and $2 in 1900, a not insignificant sum for a farm family operating on narrow margins. House calls, which were standard practice for serious illness, cost more, Surgery, if it was ever necessary, was an event of considerable financial and physical gravity. For the routine complaints of a middle-aged woman, aching joints disrupted sleep headaches. The general physical complaints of a body that had worked very hard for several decades, a visit to the doctor was considered unnecessary, probably excessive, possibly a sign of weakness. She treated herself. Patent medicines were the healthcare of ordinary Americans in 1900, and their reach was extraordinary. By the turn of the century, Americans were spending approximately $80 million per year on patent medicines, a number that represented one of the largest consumer expenditures in the country at the time. These preparations had evocative names: Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound Peruna, Dr. Pierce's favourite prescription for women hostatas' stomach bitters. They were sold through the mail, through country stores, through travelling salesmen who came through town with wagons full of bottle promises. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound deserves particular attention here because it was specifically marketed to women experiencing the kind of physical changes we've been discussing, and it was genuinely ubiquitous in American farmhouses at the turn of the century. Lydia Pinkham was a real person, a Massachusetts woman who developed her formula in the 1870s and whose portrait appeared on every bottle for decades after her death. The compound was made primarily from plant-based ingredients: black cohosh, life root, unicorn root, pleurisy root, and fenugreek. It also contained, by various accounts, a significant percentage of alcohol, somewhere between 15 and 20% by volume, which is approximately the strength of a fortified wine. Whether Lydia Pinkham's compound did anything medically meaningful for the women who took it is a question that historians of medicine have examined with some care. The consensus seems to be probably not much in a pharmacological sense, but the alcohol certainly took the edge off, and the ritual of taking something, of treating oneself as worthy of treatment, had its own quiet value that should not be dismissed. She ordered the bottle. She took it as directed. She felt perhaps marginally better, or she told herself she did. Can I ask you something? When you think about women of this era, do you picture them as stoic to the point of being somehow less sensitive than we are, tougher in a way that makes their hardship seem almost theoretical, I ask? Because I think that is a tempting and ultimately wrong way to understand them. They were not less sensitive. They were not less aware of their own physical discomfort, their own weariness, their own longing for care. They were human beings living in human bodies with the full human range of sensation and emotion. What they were was practiced at managing those sensations without external support, because the external support simply was not there. The difference between a woman in 1900 and a woman today is not that one feels more and one feels less. It is that one had language access and permission that the other did not. She hurt. She just did not say so. The physical reality of an aging body in 1900 without modern pain management, without anti-inflammatory medications, without any of the diagnostic tools that allow us to understand what is happening inside a body before it becomes catastrophic, that reality was genuinely difficult. Arthritis was widespread and untreated, or treated with preparations that offered relief more by virtue of their alcohol content than any other active ingredient. Dental health was poor by modern standards. By middle age, many rural Americans had lost multiple teeth, and the pain of dental problems in an era before reliable local anesthesia was considerable. Vision loss went uncorrected for many because eyeglasses were a luxury, and the kind of quiet, progressive deterioration in vision that we would now address with a simple prescription was for a farm woman in 1900 simply part of what it meant to grow older. Cardiovascular disease, which we now understand to be the leading cause of death in women of middle age and beyond, was almost entirely undiagnosed in this era. A woman who experienced chest pain or shortness of breath might be told she was suffering from nervous exhaustion. She might be told to rest. She might be told nothing because she might not have mentioned it, because she had a household to run and a husband to feed, and complaining about chest pain felt like an indulgence she could not afford. The diagnostic gap between what was happening in women's bodies in 1900 and what medicine could identify and address was by any modern measure enormous. And yet, I want to be careful here because there is a version of this story that becomes simply a litany of suffering, and I do not think that is true to these women's experience. What the historical record also shows alongside the patent medicines and the untreated arthritis and the undiagnosed conditions is something that I find genuinely remarkable about the way women of this era related to their aging bodies. They worked in them. Not despite the pain, not pretending the pain was not there, but alongside it with a matter-of-factness that was not denial, but something more like the pragmatic acknowledgement that the body is what you have and you use what you have. Diaries from women in their 50s and 60s in this period document with extraordinary regularity continued physical labour at a scale that would genuinely surprise modern readers. Women who were dealing with the full range of middle-age physical changes still rose before dawn, still maintained kitchens and gardens and the entire infrastructure of domestic life, still walked miles in the course of an ordinary day, not because they were required to in the same way they had been when the children were young. The urgency was different now, but the habit and the rhythm and the fundamental relationship between body and purpose that had been established over decades of hard work that did not simply stop because the children were gone or because the knees ached or because the nights were disrupted. Movement was what she knew. Work was what she knew. And there is something in the physical continuation of purposeful labour, even when the body protests, that has its own kind of medicine. There is a passage in a diary kept by a woman named Frances somewhere in rural New England in the early 1900s that I have returned to many times when thinking about this particular chapter of our story. Frances was in her mid-50s when she wrote it. Her children were grown and gone. Her husband was alive but in declining health. She herself was dealing with what she described as considerable discomfort in her hands, almost certainly arthritis that made the fine work she had always done, the needlework and the writing and the pastry making, more difficult than it had once been. She wrote, "I find that my hands do not obey me as they once did, and this is a grief because my hands have always been my best thinking. I am learning to think in other ways. It is slow. I suspect it will take longer than I have, but I am learning. I find that my hands have always been my best thinking." She meant it literally. She was a woman who worked out her ideas through the movement of her hands, through making things through the physical act of creating and doing. And she meant it metaphorically too, in a way she may not have entirely realized she was reaching for. Her hands were her agency. Her hands were the instrument through which she had shaped everything: children, food, cloth, soil, letters. And the gradual loss of their perfect obedience was to her a form of intellectual as well as physical diminishment. But notice what she did not write. She did not write, "Therefore I am done." She wrote, "I am learning to think in other ways." At 50-something years old, with arthritic hands and a quiet house and a declining husband and no pain medication, beyond whatever was in the bottle of Lydia Pinkham on the kitchen shelf, Frances was still learning, still adapting, still reaching. That quality, the reaching, is the through line in these women's lives that I keep coming back to, and it becomes most visible, most unmistakable in the chapter of their story we have not yet fully explored. Because alongside the physical changes and the patent medicines and the untreated discomforts of an aging body, in an era without modern healthcare, something else was happening to a significant number of these women. Something that frankly the culture around them was not expecting and was not entirely sure what to do with. They were waking up, not metaphorically, not in a vague inspirational sense, literally specifically in documented and historically verifiable ways. Women in their 50s and 60s, women whose children were grown and whose bodies were aging, and whose world had told them their useful years were behind them, were finding their voices for the first time, were doing things they had never done before, were becoming, in the third act of their lives, people that even they themselves had not known were there. That is the story that is waiting for us just ahead, and I promise you it is worth staying up for. There was a particular kind of worry that visited her in the small hours. Not the productive kind of worry that leads somewhere, not the worry about whether the harvest would be good enough, or whether a child's cough was serious, or whether the fence on the north field would hold through winter. Those worries had tasks attached to them. You could do something about them, or at least you could try, and the trying was its own relief. This was a different kind. The kind that circled without landing. The kind that showed up at 3 a.m. when the house was dark and her husband was breathing steadily beside her, and she was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, turning a question over and over in her mind that had no comfortable answer. What happens to me when I cannot take care of myself anymore? It was not a dramatic question. She did not frame it dramatically. She was not a woman given to drama, but it sat at the back of her daily life like a piece of furniture you have arranged so you do not have to look at it directly. There always felt in the peripheral vision of her awareness occasionally move to the centre of the room at 3 a.m, whether she wanted it there or not. To understand why this fear was so specific and so rational in 1900, you have to understand what the actual options were for an elderly woman who could no longer manage independently. And I want to be clear, this was not an irrational anxiety born of excessive worry. This was a woman doing an accurate assessment of her circumstances in a world that had constructed almost no safety net for people who outlived their usefulness as workers. In 1900, the United States had no federal old age pension system. Social Security would not exist for another 35 years. There was no Medicare, no Medicaid, no organized system of state support for the elderly poor. What existed instead was a patchwork of county-level institutions that varied enormously in their quality and their humanity, and at the center of that patchwork serving as the last resort for people who had nothing and no one was the poorhouse. The poorhouse, sometimes called the county farm or the almshouse or the infirmary depending on the region, was a feature of virtually every county in America in 1900. These were publicly funded institutions that housed together, and without much distinction, the elderly poor, the mentally ill orphaned children, people with physical disabilities, and anyone else whom the community had determined could not support themselves and had no family to support them. By the census of 1900, there were approximately 100,000 Americans living in poorhouses at any given time. The majority of them were elderly. A significant portion were women. What were these places actually like? The historical record on this question is not comfortable reading, and I want to treat it with the care it deserves, rather than turning it into something sensational. These were not in most cases places of deliberate cruelty. They were places of profound indifference, overcrowded, underfunded, staffed by people who were themselves poorly paid and often inadequately trained, designed to warehouse human beings who had nowhere else to go rather than to provide any meaningful quality of life. State inspection reports from this era, and several states did conduct periodic inspections of their poorhouse systems, document conditions that range from basic but grim to genuinely terrible. Overcrowded sleeping quarters, poor food, minimal medical care, the mixing of the elderly with the severely mentally ill, which created an environment that was frightening and disorienting for people who were there simply because they were old and poor, a near-complete absence of privacy. No meaningful activity or occupation beyond the labour that residents were required to perform in exchange for their keep laundry cooking farm work as long as the body could manage it. A woman who had spent her entire adult life as the competent centre of a household, who had made every decision about her own domain, who had organised and directed and produced and created, arriving in such a place would have experienced it as a form of obliteration. Not physical, but personal. The erasure of everything that had made her who she was. She knew this. Abstractly, she knew exactly what the poorhouse was. She had probably driven past the county farm. She might have known women who ended up there. It was not theoretical. It was a place with a road leading to it. So what stood between her and that road family? Almost entirely family. The social contract of the era unwritten but thoroughly understood by everyone who operated within it was this: children supported their aging parents. This was not charity. This was obligation. It was moral, it was cultural, and in some states it was actually legal. Several American states had by 1900 enacted what were called filial responsibility laws, statutes that formally required adult children to provide financial support for indigent parents. The specifics varied considerably by state. Some laws were rarely enforced, others carried real teeth. But their existence reflected a broader cultural consensus that the welfare of elderly parents was a family matter, not a public one, which meant in practice that the security of a woman's old age depended almost entirely on the relationship she had spent her life building with her children. Let me say that again, because I think it deserves to be said plainly. The difference between a comfortable old age and the county poorhouse for an ordinary American woman in 1900 was whether her children wanted to take care of her, and whether practically speaking they could. Now think about what that meant for the woman we've been following through this story. She had watched her children leave. She had navigated the empty house and the quiet mornings and the restructured days with as much grace as she could manage. She had written the cheerful letters. She had attended the club meetings. She had held herself together with the considerable internal resources that decades of competent, unacknowledged labour had built in her. And beneath all of it, threading through everything, was this awareness: the children she had raised, the children she was careful not to burden with her loneliness, the children she protected from her truest feelings in the letters she sent and did not send. Those children were also, in the plainest possible terms, her retirement plan. This is not a cynical observation. I do not mean it that way at all. It was simply the structure of the world. Love and need were not separate categories in this arrangement. They were woven together so thoroughly that you could not pull them apart without damaging both. And it created in the emotional life of these women a specific and rarely acknowledged complexity. She loved her children with total, unconditional, unsentimental completeness. And she also needed them to remember her kindly when the time came. And she was aware of both of those things simultaneously, and she never spoke of the second one because to speak of it would have been to poison the first. The arrival of the mothers' pension movement in the early 1900s represented for many women the first glimmer of a different possible future, though it arrived too late, and moved too slowly to help most of the women we have been talking about tonight. Starting in Illinois in 1911, states began passing legislation providing small monthly payments to mothers, specifically widowed mothers with dependent children, to help them keep their families together, rather than surrendering their children to orphanages or poor farms out of economic desperation. By 1920, all but 2 states had some form of mother's pension law. These payments were modest. In most states, they range from roughly $10 to $15 per month, enough to help, not enough to live on independently. And the programs were administered with considerable intrusiveness. Caseworkers visited homes, assessed the moral fitness of recipients, and could withdraw benefits at any time based on subjective judgments about the recipient's behavior and household management. But the principle they established was genuinely new, that society had a responsibility to provide economic support to vulnerable women and children, and that this responsibility could not be left entirely to families and private charity. It was in the language of the era's reformers a recognition that motherhood had social value that deserved social support. That idea that the decades of work these women had performed had value that the broader community owed them something in return for was so new in 1900 that most women of that generation never fully internalized it. They had been raised to see their labor as simply what women did. It was not a contribution for which compensation was appropriate. It was not a service rendered. It was just life. But the reformers who built the mothers' pension movement, many of them women who had come through exactly the kind of club meetings and civic organizations we described earlier, understood something that the culture had not yet caught up to. They understood that a system which extracted a lifetime of unpaid labor from women and then left those women with no protection in old age was not simply unkind. It was a specific and systematic failure. There is a detail from the poorhouse inspection reports of this era that I have never been able to put entirely out of my mind, and I want to share it with you because I think it says something important. Multiple state inspection reports from the 1890s and early 1900s note the same phenomenon in different locations. Elderly women in poorhouses kept things. Small things. A photograph. A piece of ribbon. A button or two. A folded letter worn soft from handling. Objects that had no monetary value and that the institution had no reason to take from them. Inspectors who noted these objects generally did so in passing, as a minor observation rather than a significant finding. But to me, those objects are one of the most humanly precise details in all of this research, because what they represent is a woman who had lost almost everything: her home, her household, her autonomy, her identity as the capable center of a family, and had held on with both hands to the physical evidence that she had been loved. The photograph, the letter, the button from a child's coat. She kept these things because they were proof that she had mattered to someone, that there had been a kitchen full of children and a table set for 7, and a house that was loud in the mornings, and that she had been at the center of it, necessary and known and irreplaceable. Even here, even now, she had been that. I want to say something directly to you, if I may. If you have a mother who is aging, if you have a grandmother, if there is a woman in your life who raised children who are now grown and gone, who got up early for decades and made breakfast for people who are now somewhere else, who wrote cheerful letters and did not say everything she felt, who worried in the small hours about questions that have no comfortable answer. She is not asking you for anything. She would not ask. She has been trained by a lifetime of practice not to ask. But the fear is there. Quieter now, perhaps, and better resourced than it was in 1900. Social security exists. Medicare exists, the county. Poorhouse does not, but some version of that 3 a.m. question is still there, still circling without landing, still waiting to be answered, not by policy, but by the particular, specific, irreplaceable fact of being remembered by someone who matters to you. The women of 1900 could not count on policy. They counted on love. Most of them were not disappointed. Most of their children did remember, did come back, did make room literally and figuratively for the woman who had made room for them first. And for those who found in that return something they had not expected, something that looked against all odds, and in the most quiet possible way like a new beginning, that is the story we have been building toward all night. Because some of these women in the years after the house went quiet did something that nobody predicted. They found themselves, not despite everything they had been through, because of it. That chapter is next, and it is the one I have been wanting to tell you about since the very beginning. Most history books, if they bother with women of this era at all, tend to focus on the famous ones. Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, the names we were taught in school, the faces on the commemorative stamps, the women whose speeches are quoted in textbooks. And those women were extraordinary, genuinely historically extraordinary, and their stories deserve every word that has been written about them. But here is what the famous women's stories can accidentally obscure: the sheer scale of ordinary transformation happening in the lives of women nobody has ever heard of, in places nobody ever wrote about during exactly the years we've been discussing tonight. The women who woke up, not dramatically, not with a single catalytic moment and a speech and a headline, but slowly in the particular way that real change happens in real lives, through accumulation, through the gradual discovery that something you thought was not possible for someone like you might actually be possible after all. I want to tell you about some of them, not the famous ones, the others. Let us start with a woman named Mary Church Terrell. She was not obscure, she was in fact a remarkable public figure, but she is not as widely remembered today as she deserves to be, and her story illustrates something specific that I want to explore in this part of our journey together. Mary Church Terrell was born in 1863 in Memphis, Tennessee, to formerly enslaved parents who had achieved significant financial success after emancipation. She received an extraordinary education by the standards of any woman of her era. She graduated from Oberlin College in 1884, at a time when fewer than 1% of American women of any background held college degrees, and she went on to earn a master's degree as well. She married, had children, raised them, and navigated all the particular demands of a life that we've been tracing throughout this story: the domestic labour, the emotional management, the years of pouring herself into family. And then in her 50s and 60s she began the work for which history should remember her most. She helped found the National Association of Coloured Women in 1896. She became one of the founding members of what would eventually become the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. At the age of 86 years old, with arthritic joints, and a body that had been working for almost 9 decades, she led a campaign to desegregate Washington District of Columbia. Restaurants personally participating in sit-ins in the early 1950s. She was not done at 50. She was not done at 60. She was not done at 86. Now Mary Church Terrell had resources and an education that most of the women we've been discussing tonight did not have. I want to be honest about that. Her path was not available to a farm woman in rural Ohio, with a 6th grade education and arthritic hands. But here is what I find so important about her story in this context: the structure of it is the same. The years of domestic life, the children, the pouring of self into family, and then the turn, the discovery that there was more, that the self which had been occupied entirely by motherhood had other capacities that had been waiting patient and intact for the space to emerge. That structure, that particular shape of a life was not unique to famous women. It was happening everywhere. What does the historical evidence actually show about women's late-life emergence in this era? The suffrage movement provides some of the most concrete data we have. When historians examine the grassroots organising that made women's suffrage possible, not the famous speeches and national conventions, but the door-knocking and petition circulating and local meeting organising, that actually built the political will for the 19th Amendment, what they find is that a disproportionate share of that ground-level work was done by women in their 40s, 50s and 60s, women whose children were grown, women who had time finally for something beyond the household. The National American Woman Suffrage Association by the early 1900s had chapters in virtually every state, and those chapters were staffed overwhelmingly by middle-aged and older women who had come to activism late. A survey of chapter officers conducted around 1910 found that the average age of a state-level suffrage organizer was 53 years old. 53. These were not young idealists. These were women who had raised families, buried parents, navigated the full weight of domestic life, and arrived at their 5th decade with something the young activist did not yet have the particular clarity that comes from having already given everything to one thing and found that there was still more of yourself left. Age strips away the self-consciousness, the things that age strips away the self-consciousness, the need for approval, the anxiety about what people think somehow leave behind a more concentrated version of whoever was there all along. That is what I see happening in the lives of these women, and I find it one of the most genuinely moving things in all of this history. A woman named Julia Lathrop was 43 years old in 1899 when she became the first woman appointed to the Illinois Board of Charities. She had spent the previous years doing settlement housework at Hull House in Chicago, work that connected directly to the networks and conversations happening in those women's clubs and church circles we discussed earlier in the story. By 1912, she became the first woman to head a federal agency, when President William Howard Taft appointed her to lead the United States Children's Bureau. Her entire public career, the career for which she's remembered, began in her 40s and continued through her 70s. She'd not been idle before that. She'd been doing the invisible, uncounted preparatory work of a life, learning, observing, building the internal resources that public work requires, waiting not passively but actively for the conditions that would allow those resources to be used. But I do not want to only talk about women who achieved formal public recognition, because the transformation I am describing was not only available to women with access to settlement houses and federal appointments, it was happening in farmhouses too, in smaller, quieter, less historically visible ways, in ways that left fewer traces in the archives but were no less real for that. There are county histories from the early 20th century, those thick leather-bound volumes that local historical societies commissioned to document the lives of their communities that contain. If you read them carefully, dozens of small portraits of ordinary women who did remarkable things in their later years. Women who started small businesses after their children left. A woman in rural Wisconsin who began making cheese commercially in her 50s, turning a household skill into a modest enterprise that provided her income for the first time in her adult life. A woman in southern Ohio who became the postmistress of her small town at the age of 57, a position that gave her both income and the kind of central social role that she had previously occupied only within her own family. Women who took up painting, who began writing for local newspapers, who taught themselves to read music and learned the organ so they could play for the church services they had been attending for 40 years. Women who, without anyone formally telling them that this was allowed, decided that the years remaining to them deserved to contain something of their own choosing. There is a woman I think about often when I turn this part of the story over in my mind. Her name was Sarah Orne Jewett, and she was a writer from Maine who spent her career documenting exactly the world we've been inhabiting tonight. The rural New England farmhouse, the aging woman, the texture of ordinary domestic life in the late 19th century. Jewett never married, she never had children, so her story is not precisely the story we've been telling. but she wrote about the women who had, and she wrote about them with a precision and a tenderness that I find unmatched in the literature of this era. In her most celebrated work, A Book of Linked Stories, published in 1896, she created a portrait of an older woman living alone in a coastal Maine town, a woman who had outlived her husband and her children's dependents, who moved through her days with what Jewett described as a kind of grave cheerfulness, a quality of being entirely present in her own life, without apology or complaint. Grave cheerfulness. I think about that phrase a lot. Not the false brightness that the culture demanded, not the cheerful and resigned acceptance that medical guides prescribed, but something harder to achieve and more genuine, a woman who had looked clearly at everything her life contained, the loss and the limitation and the ache of missing and the genuine beauty of what remained, and had chosen with full information to be here for it. That is not a small achievement. That is, in my estimation, one of the larger ones available to a human being. The suffrage campaigns of the 1910s provide perhaps the most vivid documentation of older women finding their voices, and I want to give you one specific example that I think captures the spirit of this transformation better than any statistic could. In the summer of 1915, a woman named Rosalie Jones organized what she called a suffrage hike, a walking march from New York to Washington, to petition Congress for a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. The march attracted participants from across the region, and among the walkers were a remarkable number of women, who were by the standards of any era not young. Women in their 50s and 60s walking hundreds of miles in the summer heat, in long skirts and practical boots, carrying banners and singing and stopping in small towns along the way to speak to whoever would listen. One journalist who covered the march asked an older woman participant why she had come given the physical demands of the journey. She was reportedly in her early 60s, with grey hair and the kind of weathered hands that speak to decades of outdoor work. She told him that she had spent 40 years keeping other people's lives running, and that she considered this the first thing she'd ever done entirely for herself. He wrote it down. And then in his published account he expressed mild puzzlement about why a woman of her age would take on such hardship for an abstract political cause. He did not understand what he was looking at. He was looking at a woman who had discovered in the years after her children left and her house went quiet that the self she had been managing so carefully all those years was not exhausted, was not finished, was in fact just getting started. Let me say something that I have been building toward all night through all of these parts of this story, and that I want to say plainly before we reach our ending. The women we have been following through the quiet mornings, and the letters, and the club meetings, and the arthritic hands, and the 3 a.m. worries, and the grandchildren, and the churches, and the poorhouse fears, these women were not exceptional. They were not heroines in any dramatic sense. They did not, most of them, change history in ways that got their names into books. What they did was something harder and more common, and I would argue more significant than heroism. They kept going. They kept going when the house went silent and nobody told them how to live in that silence. They kept going when their bodies began to change in ways that medicine had no language for. They kept going when the culture told them with complete confidence that their useful years were behind them, and somewhere in the keeping going, some of them, not all, but some enough to matter, found something they had not known was there. A self that had been in formation their entire lives, shaped by every difficult thing they had navigated, and every quiet strength they had built, waiting patiently for the space to step fully into the light. That discovery, what it meant, what it taught, what it left behind for the women who came after, is where this story finds its ending. And the ending, I promise you, is worth everything we have travelled through to get here. One more chapter. Let us finish this together. We've been travelling for a long time tonight, through cold October mornings and coffee tins and empty chairs, through 43 unsent letters and flower gardens that grew larger in the silence, through parlour meetings and walking marches and a woman in Pennsylvania who understood time better than most philosophers just by holding a baby. And I want to start this final chapter by telling you something I have been thinking about for a long time, something that does not often get said about the women we've spent this evening with. Most of them never knew they mattered. Not in the way that I mean it. They knew, of course, that they mattered to their children, to their grandchildren, to the tight circle of people whose daily lives their presence shaped. That kind of mattering they understood, and it sustained them. But the larger mattering, the way they're quietly endured, quietly navigated, quietly transformed lives would send ripples forward through time in ways they could not have imagined that they did not know. That was not available to them. And I think there is something important in telling them now, even if the telling comes more than a century too late. In 1963, a woman named Betty Friedan published a book called The Feminine Mystique, which is often credited with igniting the second wave of the American feminist movement. The book described what Friedan called the problem that has no name, the particular suffocating dissatisfaction of educated American women in the post-war era who'd been told that domestic fulfillment was the entirety of a woman's proper ambition, and who found living that life that it was not enough. The book sold millions of copies. It changed conversations in ways that changed laws, in ways that changed the actual conditions of women's lives for generations afterward. But here is what I want you to notice. The problem that Betty Friedan identified in 1963, the problem of a woman whose entire identity had been subsumed into her domestic role, who had lost access to her own interior life, who did not know who she was outside of her service to others, that was not a new problem in 1963. It was the same problem that a farm woman in Ohio had been sitting with at a kitchen table in 1900, pressing her hands flat on the counter and breathing without anyone to tell her what she was feeling or why it mattered. The women of 1900 did not have Betty Friedan. They did not have the language or the movement or the cultural permission to name what they were experiencing as a systemic condition rather than a personal failing. But they lived through it anyway. They processed it anyway in diaries and unsent letters and flower gardens and Wednesday meetings and the quiet reconstruction of selves that nobody was watching and nobody was recording. And the daughters they raised and the granddaughters those daughters raised carried something forward that they could not have articulated, but that was real nonetheless. A residue of survival, a demonstrated capacity for endurance, the knowledge transmitted not in words but in example, that a woman could lose the thing that had defined her and not be lost, of navigating the world that one generation develops, are passed through the texture of daily life rather than formal instruction to the next generation. The research on this process is robust and fascinating, and what it consistently shows is that what children absorb from their parents is not primarily what their parents say. It is what their parents do when things are hard. Think about what the daughters of these women absorbed growing up. They watched a woman who had lost her central role and rebuilt herself without a template. They watched a woman carry fear and longing without being destroyed by them. They watched a woman sit in a Wednesday meeting and stand up to deliver a paper she had written herself and find in the act of being heard by others something that changed her relationship to her own voice. They watched all of this from the edges of rooms, from across kitchen tables, from the particular intimate distance of being someone's child. They did not know they were watching anything significant. Children never do. But the watching went in. It became part of how they understood what women were capable of, what they themselves might be capable of. And when their turn came, when their own children grew, and the house went quiet and the 3 in the morning questions circled without landing, they had somewhere in the inherited architecture of their understanding a model. Not a perfect model, not a complete one, but the outline of a path where there might otherwise have been only unmarked terrain. Let me tell you about one more woman. This is the last one, and she is in a way all of them. Her name was Ida, and she lived in a small town in central Missouri from the late 1860s until sometime in the 1930s. She raised 4 children on a farm. Her husband died when she was 58. She lived alone for the next 20 years in the house where she had raised her family, tending a garden that was by all accounts extraordinary, the kind of garden that people came to see that was mentioned in the county history as one of the notable features of the township that school children were brought to visit on educational outings. She had started it when her youngest left home. She expanded it every year for 2 decades. By the time she was 70, it covered nearly a full acre and contained varieties of heirloom roses that she had been collecting and cultivating for years, traded through a correspondence network of gardening women that stretched across 4 states. A correspondence network of gardening women. She had built something, not a monument, not something that would change policy or make newspapers or get her name on a building, just a garden, and a community of women who shared seeds through the mail, who wrote to each other about soil conditions and winter hardiness, and the particular satisfaction of growing something beautiful for no reason, except that beauty has its own value, and she had finally at 50-something given herself permission to pursue it. When Ida died, her garden was divided among her children and grandchildren and neighbours, and the women in her correspondence network who asked for cuttings. The roses scattered across the Midwest. Some of them are probably still growing somewhere, in someone's grandmother's yard, in a garden that the current owner does not know the origin of tended carefully, because it is obviously old and obviously loved, and that seems like reason enough. This is the thing about quiet lives. They do not end cleanly, they scatter. The woman who spent 30 years making breakfast for 7 people, and then spent 20 more years figuring out who she was without that she did not leave a monument. She left something harder to see, and more durable than a monument. She left the way her daughter learned to sit with silence without panic. She left the way her granddaughter knew without being told that a woman could rebuild herself from whatever materials remained after the large things were gone. She left the particular quality of steadiness that gets transmitted through proximity to someone who has been genuinely steady, when steadiness was genuinely hard. She left, in other words, the most human thing there is to leave evidence that it is possible, that you can go through the hard middle of a life and come out the other side still intact, still curious, still against all reasonable expectations, still growing. I have spent a lot of time with these women, more time than I can fully account for honestly, reading their letters, sitting with their diaries, following the threads of their ordinary, extraordinary lives through the archives and the county histories and the margins of documents that were never meant to tell their stories but ended up doing so anyway. And the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I cannot put down, the thing that made me want to tell you this story tonight of all nights is this. They did not know we were watching. Mabel with her 43 unsent letters in the cedar chest, Agnes with her scratched-out paragraph about the baby clothes, Harriet who was less lonely after her husband died than she expected, Frances learning to think in other ways with her arthritic hands, Ida building her acre of roses in the years when the world had decided her useful years were behind her. None of them were performing for posterity. None of them were thinking about what message their lives might send forward. They were just living, just managing, just doing the quiet, uncelebrated, absolutely essential work of being a person when being a person is hard. And somehow all of that, the managing and the containing and the building and the waking up and the keeping going, somehow it reached us. Across 120 years, through all the noise and change and distance, it reached us here tonight in whatever room you are lying in, with the lights low and the fan running and the world quiet outside. So here is what I want to leave you with as we close this story. If you have a mother who woke up early for years and made things for people who have since scattered to their own lives, if you have a grandmother who wrote cheerful letters and kept the hard sentences for somewhere private, if there is a woman you love who is somewhere in the middle of the particular silence we've been describing tonight, figuring out who she is now that the loudest part of her life has moved into a different room, tell her. Not tomorrow. Now, or as close to now as you can get. Not that you appreciate her, though you do, and she knows it, and the knowing matters. Tell her something more specific than that. Tell her you see her. The actual her, not just the role. The woman who had thoughts that went unspoken and letters that went unsent, and a garden she built for no reason except that she finally had the time and the permission, and she chose beauty. Tell her that the years she spent in that particular silence were not invisible, that someone was watching, that it mattered, that she mattered not because of what she produced, not because of the children she raised, or the meals she made, or the household she held together with her capable, tireless, arthritic, extraordinary hands, but because she was here, because she endured, because she woke up one day in a quiet house and did not give up on herself, even when the culture around her had essentially no idea what to do with a woman who was finished raising children and not yet finished being alive. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Thank you. Thank you for spending this evening with a woman you never met in a farmhouse, in a town you've probably never visited in a year that seems impossibly distant from where we are now. Thank you for letting her story matter to you even a little, especially a little. That is how quiet lives get their due. One listener at a time, one night at a time. If this story moved something in you tonight, if it made you think of someone or remember something or feel something that you needed to feel, I would love to know. Leave a comment below. Tell me who it made you think of. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is, and whether the fan is on, and whether you are almost asleep. I want to picture you there. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the people, history forgot to write down the lives lived in the margins of the official record, the quiet and the real and the deeply human, then stay close. Subscribe and come back, because there are so many more women waiting to be found. So many more mornings worth waking up for. So many more letters worth reading. Good night.